Hey class. In this video we are going to be moving on to a new topic. You can see I have headphones on and that's because we're doing audio. So we'll get started with that in just a second. This week you're also going to be submitting the self-portrait and I'll take a look at those and try to get those grades back to you very soon. So if you need any help with that submission process, let me know. We can go over it. But we are moving quickly on to our next topic, which is audio. So if we're on the class site and we go into topics and go to audio, this is where we're going to be working for the next couple of weeks. So as we have talked about, we kind of move really quickly through topics in this course. We don't really get too in depth in any one topic because we just have 15 weeks to work with, and we have 5 different things that we want to cover plus our final project. So we're just going to go over some of the basics, go over a couple of the different things that we can do, and then make a very simple project. One of the things you'll notice, hopefully, is that there's a lot of similarities, even though we're working with audio, and in our previous topic, we were working with images. You're going to see there's a lot of similar terms, similar editing techniques, similar tools, software, things like that. And that's because we are still working in the sort of digital context. And so a lot of the things that we talk about and the way that we think about how this media works is going to be very similar. So for this video, I'm just going to be talking about some basic terms and properties when it comes to editing audio. So you don't need to follow along with this. I'm going to use the software just to have accessible for different examples that I want to do. But in the next couple videos, I'll go over some of the basics of editing and the interface. I'll go over how to get different types of audio into Audacity, and I'll go over how to layer your audio together and do different stuff with it. So for now, I'm going to be using Audacity, but you don't need to have it open. You can do that in the next video. But I'm going to open it up now. And I'm going to just go over some basic concepts. And I'll use Audacity to do that. So if you don't know what I did there, I hit Command Space to open up the Spotlight. This is actually how I open most of my programs. I might have talked about this already, but I'm just going to type in Audacity and hit Enter. And there we go. It's open. I have a little test audio. I'm just going to get rid of that. So this is what Audacity looks like. This is a free program, so you should be able to download it without registering or setting up an account or doing anything like that, at least for now. And it's a very basic audio editor, so it's not as robust as something like Logic or Pro Tools or Audition or Fruity Loops or Ableton Live. There's lots of different audio programs that you may have worked with in the past if you have an interest in music or editing audio. Audacity has a lot of the same features, but it's much more sort of basic, and it's really used a lot for just like simple things like a podcast that's just maybe a recording of a couple people, or recording an interview, editing simple audio. So it has enough features that we can do everything that we want to do without getting too overwhelmed. So it's a little bit different than Photoshop and Illustrator, which have every feature that you could imagine. So let's get started. I'm just going to go over a couple basic things, and let's record some audio so I can kind of give you guys some examples, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm just going to record, and in this series of videos, I'm going to kind of like imagine that I'm recording a podcast or the intro to a podcast, just like the beginning. You don't have to do that for your project. We'll go over the assignment at the end of this video, but yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing just for my example. So we can imagine that I'm recording, let's call it the Owen Roberts podcast, and that I'm going to be talking about audio. So let's record a little clip. So I'm going to click on this record button. And welcome to the Owen Roberts podcast. Today we are going to be talking about editing audio with Audacity. Okay, so I've got some audio, and I'm going to use that as a little bit of an example. So let's get into talking about audio. Let's just write audio on the screen real big so you know what we're talking about. And let's switch to this view. And so okay. So let's just talk about what audio is, basically, like the experience of sound. Oops, let me switch back. So we'll talk a little bit about the physical properties of sound. We don't need to go into a ton of detail here, but I think it'll actually be useful in terms of understanding what we're looking at when we look at the digital representation of audio and how we can think of that. So for a second, let's just take a look at this video of ripples on a pond. I'm gonna rewind a little bit. And so you can see when there is like when you throw a rock or there's some disturbance in the water, the surface of the water, we get this ripple effect, and we call that a wave. And so we can think about what's happening here. So let's imagine we have a surface of water and a rock kind of plunges into it. What's going to happen is that the water around where the rock goes in is going to get displaced. The rock is going to push that water down. And as that water is getting pushed down, it needs somewhere to go. So that's what creates a wave like this. And this is like a little 2D cutout, but you can imagine this going in all directions. And so this wave is going to kind of, go through the water and dissipate into the rest of the water. And, once the rock kind of reaches a certain level and the buoyancy of the water pushes back against it, it's going to lift up again and, come up here and then come back. And it's going to kind of keep going up and down until it settles somewhere in the water. So we get this emergence of this wave, and then it slowly dies over time. And that's actually what's happening in the air or any medium that we hear sound through. So when I talk or clap my hands or play an instrument, what I'm doing is I'm creating a force that is displacing air. And in our ears, we have these little thingies, these little hairs that can sense the sort of like rate of that displacement happening through the air. So when we talk, we're creating force, and that's displacing air in our mouth and in front of our face. And then that travels around just like our wave travels around. And so that's kind of how sound works. That's how we perceive sound. And that kind of will hopefully give you a sense of what we're looking at when we look at our audio. So let's zoom in on our audio a little bit, on our waveform. And so when we're in Audacity, you won't need to do this, but I'm just going to zoom all the way in this way. I'm going to get rid of a little bit of this at the beginning, and then I'm going to zoom way, way in, and I'll scroll over a little bit. And so what you can see here is this recording of my voice, and you see this recording, you see this waveform. And this doesn't represent all of the data that's captured. It just represents sort of the loudness of the voice at these various moments of the recording. Let me zoom out a second, actually, and I'm just going to normalize this real quick so we'll see a better representation of this. Okay, so it's a little bit louder here. And so we see that wave, and that's the recording of my voice over time. And so what we're looking at is time on the x-axis here. So this is time going this way. And then this, what we're seeing here, is changes in pressure, which sort of maps to loudness. So pressure or loudness. And so the higher it is away from here, another thing is that this is kind of 0. So if I'm not talking at all, it'll just be a straight line. But loudness, as with our wave and our water, it goes up and down. So something that's this high this way and this high this way is basically the same thing. And so that's what we're looking at when we look at a waveform. And the waveform is typically what we use to edit audio because it kind of shows us where there are loud points And it kind of maps basically to where my voice is getting louder or quieter. That makes it kind of easier to edit. So for example, let's play back this audio. And welcome to the Owen Roberts podcast. Today we are going, so if I wanted to just isolate part of this, I can kind of see where I start to talk and where I stop saying that first part of my sentence. So by representing audio as a waveform, it makes it very easy to visualize and to edit in our digital audio workstation. So I can play that back. And welcome to the Owen Roberts podcast. And I can either remove that or move it somewhere else or make it louder or do different things with it. So that's kind of why we represent sound as a waveform when we're editing. So when we're looking at this waveform, let's zoom in again. We're looking at a few different properties that describe the sound. So one is the wavelength. This is sort of the distance between waves. So if we kind of say that this wave here kind of starts here and ends here, that's one wavelength. And you can see there's a little bit of noise in there, so it's not a perfect wave, but that's okay. That's very normal with some recorded voice. There's going to be a lot of noise and changing within there. The other thing that we have, so that's wavelength. Let's write these terms up here, although they're barely legible. So that's wavelength. Then we have amplitude. Amplitude is essentially loudness. So the amplitude is how far away it is from quiet. And it's a little weird how we measure amplitude. You can see the markings over here go from 0 to 1. So 0 is completely quiet and 1 is as loud as possible. And then we kind of have all the values in between there, but there's sort of different ways that we talk about it. And then frequency is the number of waves over time. And frequency kind of roughly maps to pitch. So the higher frequency something is, the higher pitch it's going to be. And we can actually do a little bit of an example. So let's generate some waves. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller and mute my recording. And in Audacity, I can generate some audio. So I'm going to generate a tone. And I'm going to go with this frequency 440 and the amplitude is 0.8. So the amplitude is not all the way up, but high. And 440 is basically our A note, middle A note on the keyboard. So I'm going to generate that. Whoops, I want to make a new track first. And let's rewind and let's try that again. So I'm going to generate a tone. And it's very long, actually. I don't need it to be this long. Let's just do 1 second. Okay, so when we're zoomed all the way out, that just kind of looks like this big block of noise. But it has a tone to it, right? We can distinguish between that tone and let's generate another tone. So let's generate a tone that's a little bit higher. Let's do 880. So it's going to be an octave higher. So we can perceive that the second tone is higher than the first tone, but they have the same sort of octave or the same note that we consider in Western music. We're not going to get into a ton about how music and tone works, but if you're familiar with music, that might make sense to you. Anyway, if we zoom in on this, we're going to see the wavelength of this sine wave. So a sine wave is basically just a very clean wave with clean sort of curves. And that's how we get that kind of like very, sort of neutral sounding tone. And the farther we zoom in here, let's increase this a little bit, we can see, so 0.8 is about here, right? If this is 1, 0.8 is about here, and 0.8 is about here. So that's our amplitude. That's how loud it gets. If this was lower, if this was more like this, we'd have a quieter sound. Then the frequency is basically how many wavelengths we have. So this is one wavelength, and the more of these that we have, the higher pitch we're going to get. So let's see if we can edit this real quick and see these side by side. Or actually, I can just probably scroll. I'll put my cursor in between these two pieces of audio, and zoom in. And if we can get close, I'm going to have to move this guy right here and then put the cursor here. If I zoom in, so you can see our A4 here is twice as big as our A5 over here. So that's how we get the two different tones. The lower tone has a lower frequency or fewer waves per time. Our higher tone has a higher frequency, so there's more waves over time. And so that's roughly how we get this perception of pitch, lower tones versus higher tones. And there's sort of like a general range of frequencies that people can hear. So it goes from about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. So if I created a sine wave, so this one, remember, is 440. So this is much higher than 20 hertz, but much lower than 20,000 hertz. This one's 880. Most of what we hear on a day-to-day basis is somewhere in the range between 400 and 1,000 or maybe 1,200 hertz. But that's sort of the range of human hearing. Other animals can hear, a dog can hear very loud tone or very high tones. So that's why dog whistles are very, very high pitch. People won't hear them, but dogs will hear them. And so that's just kind of, the physical property of sound. Okay, so let's talk about what this data actually represents. So this is actually quite similar to what we talked about with our images in terms of what the data consists of. So if we zoom in on this data, I'm going to use my voice recording from earlier. So I'm just going to choose a little section. I'm just going to zoom in. And the more I zoom in, eventually we're going to start to see these dots. And so what these dots are is samples. So each one of these dots is a sample. And you might remember this from when we talked about digital imaging. A sample is basically when we take one piece of data at a specific time. And if we look at what we're recording at 44,100 hertz. That means we're recording 44,100 samples per second. So that's an incredible number of samples. And so if we zoom out a little bit, you'll see, like, if we look at this looks like a decent number of samples, right? But if I select this portion of our audio and play it, it's like barely, it's a tiny fraction of time. So that's how many samples are required just to create this little blip that you can barely even hear. So each one of those samples is a moment in time, and we see the loudness here, but we don't actually see the data that's recorded. So if we want to see that, we can change our view in Audacity over to the spectrogram. And so this will show us all the frequencies that are being recorded at each one of those samples. So let's actually line them up together. So let's go to multi-view and let's zoom out a little bit. And so you can see the ranges of frequencies that are being recorded at each one of these samples. So you can see why we tend to edit using the waveform. It's just a little bit easier to use amplitude as a basic indicator of where we are in our audio. But the spectrogram shows us the actual frequencies. So from 0 down here up to 20,000 up here, we see the frequencies, and the sort of brighter the color here, the louder that frequency is. And so that's how we can sort of see what's in our audio. And so you can see with my voice recording, there's a lot of sort of lower frequencies. It's very hot or very white around 300 or 400. It kind of tapers off around 1,000. That's kind of the general range of the human voice. If you have a lower voice, you'll see higher values down here. If you have a higher voice, you might see more values collected up there. But you'll generally see something more or less like that. If you start to see, there's some very light tones up here or frequencies up here. So there's a really wide mix of different frequencies as I'm talking. There might be other noises in the background and things like that that come into the recording. And we can kind of see all that here. And, it's interesting to see this, but we don't really use this view that often. If you're really, get into very sophisticated editing, you can kind of change the frequencies here. But most of the time, we're just going to be using the amplitude as a way, or the waveform view as a way to kind of basically mark when I'm talking more loudly or quietly, and use that as our sort of benchmark for editing. Similar to audio, at each one of these samples, there's like a certain amount of information that's recorded. So each one of these dots represents a certain amount of data that's part of our sample. You can see that right here in very tiny text. It says 32-bit float. So that basically means that each one of these samples is a 32-bit piece of data. And we can change that here if we go to audio and we go to format. We can set it to 16, 24, or 32-bit. This will roughly correspond to how much detail is in each sample. And that can go, on Audacity, we can't do this, but basically you could have just on or off. So it could be 0 or 1, kind of like black and white in our image. But as we add more data, just like in our image, as we add more color values, we get more detail, we get better contrast, we get better, more smoothness and more quality from our audio. We can also set the rate here. So the default for a lot of audio recording, especially for digital recording, especially for something that's just going to be, on the internet or a podcast, might be around 44K hertz. If you want slightly better audio, you might go to up to 48. You might have that on, if you're listening to Spotify or some music, you might have a slightly better sampling rate. If you're doing something for like a film and you want really high quality audio that's going to be very loud, you would usually bump up to 96 hertz. And then you could go from there, but obviously the more samples you add, the more data gets added, the harder it is for your computer to save all the information and process all the information at a regular rate. So there's some constraints related to that. So that's sampling, and the amount of data is also referred to as the bit depth. We also call that quantizing, or how much data is in each part. And so we'll pretty much just leave these settings the same when we're using Audacity, because we're not too worried. We're not, we don't need to make the most high quality thing, but we want something that's audible and, is clear to listen to. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to cover. We're going to go into some of the more specific details as we actually begin to work on the project. So I'll talk about things like audio file types. I'll talk about how to record audio and get audio from your phone into a program. And we'll look at other resources and other places where you can download audio. So let's take a quick look at our project that we're going to be working on. And I'll review this again in other videos, but just to kind of go over it. So this is the prompt for our audio project. You can obviously do something different if you prefer, but this is kind of the basic prompt that we have set up, is to create an audio portrait of a place. So you can go somewhere that you like to go to, whether it's maybe a park or your favorite restaurant or the subway, different places where you might be able to record some audio. And so one part of the project is to record some audio yourself. And I recommend using your phone for this if you have experience with audio stuff. We used to have to, check out audio recorders and do all this stuff, but everybody has a very, pretty sophisticated audio recording device. If you have a iPhone or an Android phone or something like that. Or if you have your iPad or your computer, pretty much everything these days has some audio recording technology built into it. So you can just use that to record some audio. And then we're going to layer that with audio that we find on the web. So we can use Creative Commons resources, just like we did with our image project, to find music and sound effects and other audio that we may want to include in our project. So that's what we're going to be working on. You could do an interview, you could just record a monologue of yourself. There's lots of different directions you could take this in, but this is sort of the basic idea. So if you have other ideas of things that you would like to do, just reach out to me. You can email me or send me a message on Discord, and I'm sure I'll be open to lots of different concepts. But yeah, that's it for this video. I'm going to break the other videos down into some smaller chunks. So I'll have one video that's completely dedicated to just going over the Audacity interface and how to make some basic edits. I'll have another video where I go over getting audio from different sources into Audacity. And then the third video will be on layering the audio together. So I'll go on over a couple techniques for that. So that's it for now, and I'll see you guys in the next video.